There's one other thing you need to know before you can make that jump to manual, and that's how to read your in-camera light meter. And that's exactly what I'm going to explain in this video. If you're new to this channel, my name is Richard Gill. I'm a professional photographer. On this channel I provide free photography training for those of us who are a little bit older, bit of grey in our hair, not much hair left at all. So if that sounds like you, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Right, let's talk about the in-camera light meter. Now the first thing you need to understand is the difference between incident light and reflected light. And I'll illustrate that with one of my dodgy sketches. So we start with a light source. Let's imagine we're taking an outdoor portrait. So we've got the sun shining. Here we've got our subject being photographed. They've got a nice smiley face because they love having their picture taken. And then we've got some things in the background. As we're outdoors, let's imagine it's a landscape with some trees and mountains and so on. Now the sun is going to shine, and this light that's hitting our scene is called our incident light. So it's light that originates from the source and hits our scene. Now we're over here with our camera taking and composing our shot, and the light that comes into the camera is what's reflected off our subject and the background, and that's the reflected light. And that's what your light meter measures: reflected light, not incident light. This is what your exposure meter looks like on the back of your camera. You probably also see this in your viewfinder, either underneath the screen or maybe to the left or right, or possibly even above. And you get a little scale and a plus side on one and a minus on the other. So plus is for overexposure, minus for underexposure. And what you should do is line up the little marker on the 0 for a perfectly exposed photo. And here we are at a 40th of f8. Now if I want to underexpose it, I could now reduce my aperture. That's a higher f number, and you can see I can take it down to 2 stops underexposed here, and the little marker is showing -2. And if I want to go the other way and overexpose, maybe I should increase my shutter opening time, so that's a longer shutter speed, and you can see if I take that up to a 1/6 of a second, I'm now 2 stops overexposed. I could of course have done the same thing by adjusting the aperture, and as you see, if I make the aperture wider, I can get the same amount of overexposure for a fixed shutter speed. Now if you're photographing something like a landscape with lots of different lighting conditions, some shadows, some highlights and so on, your reflected light reading that your camera is taking should be pretty good, and you just line up the exposure meter in the camera on the 0 and you should have a well exposed photograph. And of course you could play with that by underexposing a little bit if you wanted the sky to be the correctly exposed part, or alternatively maybe overexpose a little bit if your interest is in the ground or in the foreground, for example. And here's a shot that's just taken as standard, and you can see it's reasonably well exposed. Now what if you're photographing a very dark scene, and I've set something up here just with a leaf against the dark background. Now remember, our camera is always trying to average the scene out to mid-grey, and if you haven't seen my video on histograms, take a look at that now, and you should consider subscribing to the channel if you want to understand more how your camera works that way. Now what I would expect in a very dark scene like this is my histogram should be over to the left. So I'm going to set my camera up now, and we'll set it at 0, and you can see the histogram is slap bang in the middle because that's where it wants its mid-grey, but I know that's not right. Now I know my camera pretty well, and I think by underexposing by 1 stop I should get a good result, so that's what I'm going to do. And there's the finished photo, and that's come out nicely. Now alternatively you might have a scene that's very light, so I've done the same thing. I've switched my background to white, and again you see the histogram is It's pretty much in the middle because it's aiming for mid-grey. But actually I know it should be over to the right because I've got a very light scene with a lot of white there. And because I'm measuring reflected light, that's why it's pushing the histogram and underexposing the photograph. So what I've got to do is the same again, and I know from experience by overexposing by about one stop I'll get the result I need. Now let me show you what's really going on with a light meter that's measuring incident light. So that's the light that's falling on the scene. So if I measure the lighting against the black background, it's telling me an exposure of a 15th of a second at f9. Now if I flip this card over, put the white background in, so we've got potentially a lot more reflected light, but we haven't changed the incident light at all. Let's measure that again. And hey presto, we get exactly the same amount of light, so 15th of a second at f9. And so that's really the difference between incident and reflected light. And remember, your camera is measuring reflected, so bear that in mind when you're setting your exposure. If you've enjoyed this video and you're really keen to get to grips with manual, make sure you come along and watch my next video, where we'll be out in the field taking some photos in purely manual mode, and I'll show you that whole decision making process and what you do when you're taking photos in manual. Now before you do that, what I would suggest you do is make sure you fully understand aperture, shutter and ISO, and you'll find videos on those in this playlist, and once you fully understand those, making the jump to manual is very straightforward, and it'll really transform your photos as well. Now, if you'd like some feedback on your photos, do join our Facebook group. There's a link in the description below. And make sure you subscribe to the channel. Do tell your friends. Please like this video. And if you want to get notified next time I release a video, then hit that bell icon too. I'll look forward to seeing you in part 2 and hopefully seeing some of your photos in the Facebook group. See you then.